Andrew certainly likes, young, pretty girls. Allegations that Virginia Giuffre brought against Andrew have never been investigated by the police. I wanted to find out, who was accompanying him on these trips, or were they there to help Andrew? For the night when he was in London and Virginia Giuffre accuses him of having gone to bed with her.
Yeah.
And he claims that he was in Windsor.
Oh,
so
very suspicious.
There's plenty of evidence, pictures of him and testimony in papers for the period saying he came out of a nightclub sweating.
Yeah.
And plenty of things, how the last time you saw Epstein, the first time you met Epstein, the files were destroyed. And when I asked when they'd been destroyed, I was told after I'd asked for them. I mean, this is the behavior of Russia and China, the way that they curate the narrative, they destroy records. If you make life difficult, we can make life difficult for you. So you have to ask, is there a rule for the rich and powerful and a rule for everyone else?
Is there evidence you've heard about Andrew and the allegations? What has it been like writing about and trying to expose some of the abuses in the royal history, Mountbatten, Prince Andrew? What's the reaction been to you?
Well, it's two stages really. First of all, the problem of getting access to the material. Royal files are generally closed. For example, I'm doing Prince Andrew at the moment. Those files will be closed until 2065, 105 years after his birth, so he'll be dead, as will I. But and when you do find things, as I did, for example, find the FBI file on Mountbatten for my book on him, saying that he had a predilection for pedophilia, the files were destroyed. And when I asked when they'd been destroyed, I was told after I'd asked for them. So there's a sort of hoovering up process that goes on even when things begin to emerge. And again, with Mountbatten, we know that car logs were kept at Classy-Bourne, where he some boys in August 1977 who I interviewed for the book. We know that those car logs still exist, but the Guard are refusing to release them on the grounds that they're part of a murder investigation. But the murder took place 2 years later, and someone has gone to prison. He's actually come out of prison, and to be honest, they shut down the whole story because of the Good Friday Agreement. So we have this the whole time. The Kincora Boys Home, which is where one of the boys was from. Again, the files there have been heavily weeded, what we call dry cleaned. And though they've eventually found their way because of campaigns by various people, including Chris Moore, who's a journalist in Ireland, to release them, there's nothing in them. And what's also very clear is when they do have hearings, they're very prescribed terms, and they select very tame judges. I mean, that's there in the correspondence. So the reaction is generally either to say nothing and hope the problem goes away, or to try and discredit the messenger, like me, to say that they're not serious historians, there's nothing new in this, etc. So there is, and they use the tame historians who rely on basically being given the tidbits. So it's a sort of carrot and stick policy. If you go along with us, we'll make life easy. We'll put you on quangos. If you make life difficult, we can make life difficult for you. So as you know, I think I've talked in the past about the close to £500,000 it cost me in a legal case to get access to Mountbatten's diaries and letters. And this wasn't a case I brought. This was a case that was brought against me, an appeal against the Information Commissioner, who is the regulator to which I was joined. And we know that they brought that case knowing that the material should have been open. It was bought with public monies. All the fundraising was on the basis it would be open. And one of the ironies is they released all the material that they'd fought to keep closed for 10 years just before the hearing. So in the end, the hearing was just about a few exemptions. So they can make life difficult. I mean, I've put in some subject access requests, which you can do now under data protection, to see what public authorities have on you, the correspondence. And that the Cabinet Office said that they had so much material that they were refusing to release it because of the cost compliance element. So I then narrowed the research, as it would take 965 hours, I think, to go through it. So I restricted it to 6-month periods. And even then, that released about 100 pages showing that they were monitoring the most obscure book talks that I gave, an employment tribunal former employee had brought, a defamation case against me, both of which I'd won, Applications for jobs in government, public appointments were shared with the Cabinet Office. So it's kind of sinister. And again, there's a lot of briefing to the press. Complete lies are told about something. And for example, David Owen, the former private foreign secretary, was a supporter of mine. And he was just fed a tissue of lies by the Cabinet Office about the case. Wow. And they lied to Parliament, they lied to the courts, and they've lied to the media.
What does it feel like to be sort of public enemy number one? Would you say you are a heretic in this sense, as a publisher and a writer and historian going against the grain?
Well, I mean, principally as a writer, yes. Yes, I mean, and I think they don't like it because it's not as if I'm a madman. I have a PhD, former Cambridge Fellow. You can hear I seem reasonably sensible. Yeah. I put footnotes in. Yeah. And so it's much more difficult to do that. Also, my books have had good critical coverage in the past as serious books with serious research. So it's more difficult to try and discredit me. But so, I mean, I'm not certainly public enemy number one. In some ways, it makes me want to go on further because I think, why should they get away with this? And I think also it's about the relationship between the governed and the government. And if the civil service or politicians can't be trusted and aren't transparent, then that goes to the very heart of the relationship of being in a democracy. I mean, this is the behavior of Russia and China, the way that they curate the narrative, they destroy records. Something like 95% of historical records are destroyed with no record kept.
Who is responsible for this? Because it does sound like the Stasi or something, doesn't it? And who's the person at the top going, right, destroy those records?
Well, I don't think there's one person who's masterminding it. There's something called the Knowledge Management Department, which is the sort of records management element of the Cabinet Office. And they seem to be one of the prime movers in this. I mean, the irony is that they're in charge of information regulation. They employ the regulator, which is why the regulator perhaps pulls his punches a bit. Because what the Cabinet Office have done is they've basically halved the money given to the information regulator as their workload has doubled. So that helps cut down anything. The Cabinet Office are one of the worst offenders of FOI infringement. And because
freedom of information, just for those, it's the same in the US, is it?
Yes, it is. Sorry, yes, I'm using freedom of information. And, there are laws. There's Freedom of Information Act. I mean, there are laws. And there's a Public Record Act saying this material should be released. So I think they're one of the prime movers. And some records management elements of government departments are good. I mean, for example, MI5 have a regular release program, and there's some very interesting stuff coming out. A lot of SOE files, Special Operations Executive from World War II are coming out, and it's leading to reassessments of our history, to books, and really pushing forward scholarship. I mean, the worst offenders, I think, probably are people like the Metropolitan Police, who should be upholding the law, who admit that most of their records they haven't even catalogued going back to the 1930s. So it's a real mess, but no one seems concerned about FOI. No politician is going to vote for Christmas. It's like a turkey.
Why again? Like, what is it? Why would the police do it? Is it just out of carelessness, or are they going like, no, we need to protect the royals?
Well, it's not just royal stuff. There is a culture of secrecy. I think the fact is they don't know what they've got, so it's easy to say we haven't got it because they haven't done the cataloguing. I think there is just, clearly there's law enforcement elements. There are personal data elements which are very sensitive with the police. But I think they go way over the top. So, for example, I've got a case at the moment where I asked for a protection file for the Duke of Windsor from 1932, so it's almost 100 years old. And the Information Commissioner agreed with the Met that the release of this document would imperil the present safety of the royal family.
Oh, my God.
And so I took it to a tribunal, and that tribunal was last November, over a year ago, and they still haven't reported. It was a half-day tribunal. But their argument was that, and there's no evidence to support this, that terrorists might go into the National Archives, wade through a 500-page file, which is all about the subsistence allowance for detectives, and somehow find some element to kill the royal family. And this is from Prince Harry, who's given away, for example, the floor plan of Buckingham Palace in spare. Yeah. So the whole thing is just ridiculous. And all one can do is keep shouting about it in the hope that the public will pick up on this issue. Historians will begin to lobby Parliament, and parliamentarians, and there are many parliamentarians who write books and are historians, will come forward and do something about it.
Yeah. Do they have files on all of us? Have they got files on me? Have they got files on everyone who's spoken about the royals or high-standing members of parliament?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the Cabinet Office, their files are based on what they call media monitoring. They want to just chart public opinion. And they certainly kept files on people, for example, who were critical of what was happening during COVID, anyone who's critical of the royal family. I'm a monarchist, but it doesn't mean that they should be given a free rein to behave as they wish above the law. You may have a file, I don't know. I mean, given the sort of people you talk to, possibly. I mean, MI5 clearly keep files. But the problem is we just don't know. I mean, I know I got some material from the Cabinet Office, but I know it's only a small fraction of what they could have provided. And quite often I do these subject access requests across different departments, and I get one side of a correspondence and not the other from one. So you know that there's a lot more out there that's revealed by some of the information you've already got.
Some of the stuff you've been looking into involves Prince Andrew. I know the book is far off. You're thinking of that in some time yet.
Yeah, 2025, I think.
2025. Probably. I guess what controversy is that going to bring about? Where are some of the places you're poking, and are you concerned for your life, really?
No, I think I'm touch wood okay. But yes, the focus is on his time as a public servant when he wasn't a member of the royal family, in effect, but working for the government. And this was the 10 years when he was a trade envoy from 2001 to 2011. And there was a lot of criticism of his role there, which was meant to drum up British trade. But there were suggestions that he took some of his chums, people who paid off debts, for example, for his ex-wife, and that he was doing business himself as a fixer. These are accusations that have been made often by people who were dealing with him, so diplomats and perhaps some of the people on the tour. So I wanted to find out, who was accompanying him on these trips, and what were the arrangements. Now, the papers for the Trade Department and the Foreign Office for that period have to be released after 20 years unless they fulfill certain exemptions. So we should have basically the papers going back to at least 2003, when he had 2003. So we should have the first 2 years of that period. But all the files, as I say, are closed until 2065.
That's mad.
Yeah. And, you ask, for example, who was on the royal flight. Can I have the flight logs? They refuse to release them or say they don't have them. The line is they don't have them. The Foreign Office and the Trade say they have no record of this 10 years. And I've talked to diplomats who organized the trips, who were dealing with all the correspondence. You say there's voluminous correspondence dealing with this, which must be somewhere, but no one will say where it is, or if it's been kept. And this, of course, would be very revealing. Who were on these trips? Were they there drumming up trade for Britain, or were they there to help Andrew? And if, he wanted to clear his name, you would have thought he would be happy for these logs to come out. So, for example, we know for the night when he was in London and Virginia Giuffre accuses him of having gone to bed with her.
Yeah.
And he claims that he was in Windsor. We do have the logs. Well, the logs are kept by the protection officers, and there will be logs, for example, who came in and out of Buckingham Palace on that night. And yet those logs, which are less than 20 years old, have been destroyed, they say.
Oh.
So you have to wonder, why are they being destroyed? I mean, these are logs which are normally kept.
It's very suspicious.
So there's a lot of material that's rather suspicious, as you say, is being destroyed after the event.
It's very worrying because I don't have a strong opinion about the monarchy either way. They seem to be quite an interesting thing to have and a symbol that unites people in some respects. And I understand both sides.
Well, I think that, they do a terrific job in terms of soft power and tourism earnings. They unite the nation. They do a terrific amount of work for charity. So I think there are lots and lots of very good things about the monarchy, but that doesn't mean that they, as I say, should be above the law, that they should be feathering their own pocket from public work. Yeah. They shouldn't be, there are allegations that Virginia Giuffre brought against Andrew have never been investigated by the police. No, if it was you and me, something would have been done. So you have to ask time and time again, is there a rule for the rich and powerful and a rule for everyone else?
Yeah, absolutely. And when they get involved in the royal family in politics, as he was doing, I mean, trade, that's politics, isn't it, that he's getting involved in, for that to then be locked away, that's a huge problem. Because that's not democracy then. That's not transparency.
Well, exactly. I mean, any other trade delegate would be open to some sort of scrutiny. The papers would be available. And so why is he different?
Wow. And so, I mean, the suspicion then, and I don't think we'd be the first to say it, is that he might be guilty of doing, I mean, I don't know about if he said he was in Pizza Express, was he he doesn't sweat and all of these things?
Well, exactly. I think one of the problems when he did the Newsnight interviews, he made a series of assertions, one of which, as you say, was he didn't sweat. Well, there's plenty of evidence, pictures of him and testimony in papers for the period saying he came out of a nightclub sweating.
Yeah.
And plenty of things, how the last time he saw Epstein, the first time he met Epstein, have been shown to be palpably untrue. So we have to ask, on these trade delegations, he didn't always stay with the ambassador. He went to hotels, which we paid for, 5-star hotels. Why did he do that? Was that because he didn't want to be seen to be doing whatever he was doing? And we know there were requests being put to diplomats, for example, by members of his staff, asking for them basically to produce Pretty Woman for him.
Is that right?
One woman who gave him a massage lost her job when she spoke out about it. So there are a lot of big questions about him. He's very close to a man called David Rowland, who who runs a bank for basically very, very rich people. And they're just the sort of people that Andrew's meeting. Rowland has been on one of these trips, I understand. And Rowland paid off some of Fergie's debts. So there's a suggestion that Epstein may have gone on some of these trips as well. There's a case that's just going through the court at the moment where large sums of money were placed in Andrew's bank account, hundreds of thousands of pounds, which he couldn't really explain. And some money was put in his daughter's bank account. They claimed it was a wedding present or money to organize a party. And this was from someone who hardly knew them. So, but the press don't really report these cases. People are turning a blind eye, and they know that. And that means that their behavior, and I said it's only a limited number of royals, of which I think Andrew is one of the worst offenders, are behaving like this.
It really infuriates me because I've only just started a business for this and I've never done all the business stuff. I'm not very good at it. And I'm suddenly realizing, oh my God, I've got to pay 20% VAT on this and that's just my earnings. And there's another percentage and another, and it's all going away and I can't believe it. And the amounts are minuscule compared to what Prince Andrew's dealing with. And I'm paying it all. Why isn't he doing it? I can't believe he's not held to the same standard, or at least even more of a standard.
Well, I mean, there was a big fight for the Queen to pay tax, and eventually that happened. But they're now at the civil list, the money that's given to her, the sovereign grant, I think is tied into inflation and a percentage of their profits. And of course, they're making record profits. The Duchy of Lancaster and Cornwall. Yeah. So, there was a big controversy the other day because money that isn't, when people die and test it, that money goes, for example, the Duchy of Lancaster, that goes into Charles's pocket. Yeah. So there are a lot of controversies about their wealth. The wills are sealed. We don't know what's in them. Are they doing tax dodges? We have the extraordinary story of Andrew's marital home, Sunninghill Park, given to him by the Queen, cost £5 million. She then basically gifted it to him. And so he did a complicated thing through a trust, so he didn't pay capital gains on it when it was sold. It was sold for way above the valuation. By that point, it had been basically abandoned and was derelict. And the man who bought it for more than £3 million over the asking price turned out to be one of the dictators that he was doing business with as a trade
It's just mad. I can't handle that. I can't believe some of this stuff.
It sort of puts people off. I mean, the monarchy does a great job, but I think these people, these bad apples, affect people's view of the monarchy. And, we're seeing, with the problems over Harry and Meghan, as well as Andrew, and the whole racist debate that's going on at the moment. That is quite a sort of big thing for the royal family because, it's not so much here. We don't necessarily believe what Meghan Markle says, but they believe it in the States. And this is just sort of lighting the paper in the Caribbean. We're seeing people leave the Commonwealth. There's this big debate about slavery and the involvement of the royal family. And so this all plays very badly if the royal family are seen to be racist.
Wow. Well, let's get on to Meghan and Harry in a minute, because I do want to ask you about that. Just one last thing on Andrew. His character, I understand, is just not a nice bloke, is he? 'Cause I remember hearing weird stuff about teddy bears, and also just being incredibly rude to staff. Is that right?
Yes, he's very rude to staff. He's very arrogant. He feels he's this, the son of the monarch. He can behave as he wants, and he believes in the divine right of kings. So he'll summon staff, from downstairs to open the curtains, which he could open himself.
Oh, God.
He'll use a police protection officer to go and pick up his golf balls when he sends them down the fairway. I have to say, very few people had a good word to say about him. And he stands on ceremony. There's a famous story with this commanding officer in the Navy, and Andrew said to him, "You can call me Andrew." And the commanding officer said, "Yes, and you can call me sir." But, lots and lots of stories how, he's been very jovial one minute, and he'll come in at a weekend party the next, and people are reading the papers and chatting, and he'll say, "Shall we do this again?" And they look at him in surprise, and he says, "You stand up when I come in."
Oh, what a piece of shit. I can't handle it. At the same time, he's a product of his environment to an extent. You grow up like that. I mean, this is what I think about Harry as well. You grow up in that kind of environment, and you're sort of the spare.
Well, but, remember, they've both gone to, they've not been educated at home. I mean, they've gone out to school. They've mixed in the rough and tumble of service life. They both served in action. So, these are not people who've been mollycoddled. And also there are plenty of members of the royal family, his other siblings. I mean, Edward and Anne don't behave like this. They're completely different. I mean, very good to the staff. The staff are very loyal to them. I mean, it's a huge turnover of staff for Andrew. So, it's about character, I'm afraid, not about the upbringing.
Is there evidence you've heard about Andrew and the allegations with regards to, I suppose, was it trafficking and the women being procured for him by Epstein? Is there evidence that you can't reveal, that it might be too much?
Well, I mean, he was very close to Epstein. He went supposedly to end this relationship and stayed for several days with him while he did so. There's no doubt that Epstein opened doors for him business-wise, and vice versa, introduced him to useful people. And also Epstein, was a trafficking woman. I mean, that's pretty clear. And providing women for his guests, people who are on the Lolita Express, people who are staying with him. And, it's not just Virginia Giuffre's come forward, but others. There's the famous film of him sort of whispering sweet nothings to someone as she left Epstein's home in New York. So I think other women have come forward. A lot of people have been paid off. A lot of people too scared to speak. But I think there's a certain amount of evidence. I mean, I don't think he took advantage of the women who were on offer. And I don't think they were that young. I mean, we're talking about women probably 16 up. We're not talking about little children. Which in the UK,
there'll be a different feeling for British viewers than American viewers.
Yeah, and I think also there are a lot of very mature-looking 16-year-olds. So we're not looking. I mean, Mountbatten was involved with 12-year-old boys. I mean, that's a very different story.
The difference between that P word and hebephilia, which I believe J.D. Salinger was the famous person who had that, which is an attraction to post-pubescent or pubescent.
Oh, well, it's new to me, yes. But I mean, Andrew certainly likes, young, pretty girls. But he also likes, older women. He's had a whole series of relationships with much older women, more of his own age. So I don't think he's a paedophile at all. And, to be fair, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that picture was doctored.
Do you think it was?
I haven't come to a conclusion on it yet, but some of the stuff that I've been shown is quite convincing. Where the arm should be. I mean, experts in taking photographs. The reflection in the eyes, the perspectives, and of course we don't have the origin of the picture, and the person who discovered it with him. Sharon Churchill has begun to distance herself from Virginia Giuffre. Giuffre's testimony has been shown to be not always consistent. She accused Alan Dershowitz, an American lawyer, of having been trafficked to her, and he won a case against her, or she settled a case. So it's a very murky area, and trying to get the truth is very difficult because you're relying on only a few people who were there who are all saying different things.
Not an easy book to write.
Not easy. I mean, libel will be a big problem. And of course, the no doubt records, which is what I normally rely on, and the testimony. People don't talk. There's an omerta around the royal family. They either want to remain within the circles, or they're scared, or they don't want to get involved. So much easier to say no or not answer than to get involved.
With Meghan and Harry, going back to what you were saying before, I get the feeling, it might just be my YouTube bubble, that Americans don't necessarily believe her about the race and the unconscious bias.
Yeah, I think she's kind of gone too far this time. I mean, remember, this is only through her own spokesperson, in effect, Scobie. But, it would have been very easy for her to come forward and say, look, there's been a huge misunderstanding here. I never said anyone was racist, and I'm sorry for any upset it's caused. But her silence, speaks volumes. But also that, the version of the story has changed. It was one person, then it was two, there's suggestions that maybe three. It was told to Harry. It was concern rather than anything else. So the whole story has moved each time. And so I think, and she's been shown to be a liar on so many things. I mean, the car chase in the center of Manhattan where no traffic moves at more than 5 miles an hour.
So it's insidious, really, to play on the memory of Diana in that way.
Yes. She's very cynical and not very bright. And, I think people, even in the States, are getting wise to her. I think we've been wise to her for a long time. And when I was interviewing for my Mountbatten book, which came out in 2019, so this is a good six years ago, there was concern then about Meghan. And that was even, I think, before they got married. So I think people knew where she was coming from, and the whole history, the fact that she's fallen out with her own family, she's cancelled all her friends, I think is quite revealing about her character.
Eventually, the buck stops with somebody, and maybe her. The Omid Scobie. I mean, this is actually, I didn't even think to ask you this, but this could be as you're a publisher. How could Omid Scobie's book, a manuscript of it, and I think we can name who was named now because everyone has, because Piers Morgan did.
Yeah.
They named Charles and Kate, was it? And even then, it's not clear because it appears that Kate is just talking in a letter to Charles about that I don't even know, but about whether the baby. I mean, and then there's a separate question about if that's racist at all, because most people don't think it is.
Exactly, it's curiosity.
Yeah, but how did that get into the Dutch translation?
I think what happened was that an early version of the manuscript, before it had been properly legaled, was sent for translation. So what normally happens is the book comes in, it's edited, it will then have a legal read, and things will be taken out. And clearly you'd put the names in, and they were taken out for the British and other editions. But through some cock-up, the version was sent to Holland, and they didn't get the final version. That's one explanation. But I think it's interesting that Holland is the smallest territory that you can sell rights to. So if you're going to pulp a book, that's the best territory to do it in. It's only about 2,000 or 3,000 copies. So
I like this.
If you want an excuse to get a story out and claim it's a cock-up, then doing it through the Dutch publishers. What will be interesting is his agent has taken the blame for it. And it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether action is taken against the agent for that. And I mean, we all have to have insurance to cover cock-ups like that we might just inadvertently make, or if the whole thing goes quiet. So that's what I would recommend. See what happens, what actions are taken, because the Dutch publisher will have lost money, clearly, pulping a book and having to reprint it. And who's going to make up that cost?
Interesting. What about Luxembourg? Is that not an area? Belgium?
Well, those wouldn't be separate territories. I mean, Holland is a separate territory. I mean, the other thing is Holland is such a small territory because they all speak English anyway. So they're very, that's why the runs there are so small, because everyone's going to buy it in English anyway. And the cost of translation is high. Why would you bother translating it to people who could read it, who want to buy it and could read it in English anyway? And that's true of Scandinavia as well, but they're slightly bigger markets.
Interesting. I'm really fascinated by that. I did wonder, because so obviously there is a conspiracy around, people are wondering, was this done as a PR stunt? Because it got so many more people talking about the book.
Yeah. Well, I think my instinct would be towards the PR stunt. that there was they could say that it was a genuine accident, but these sort of accidents, particularly on a high sensitive book like that, don't happen. You are very, very careful what you send out. We don't send out anything which hasn't been legaled already to anyone, whether it's for serial or whether it's for foreign rights. So it doesn't really get beyond the editor and the lawyer until it is in a fit state to go out, because you could be sued. So I'm a little cynical about the whole exercise.
And then he says he never wrote, or Miss Scobie never even wrote this in any manuscripts.
Well, that must be a complete lie.
It has to be, doesn't it?
No translator only translates, as they said. They don't add anything.
I felt really sorry for the translator that sort of doorstepped her, and she, this poor woman who's
just doing her job. Yeah. Well, I mean, you can't trust anything Scobie says either. No. I think the interesting thing is supposedly it's only sold 6,500 copies, because I think one of the sad things is, you can write the complete rubbish and people out of curiosity will buy the book. I mean, Spare is a good example, which I think is the fastest selling book ever, and has made him a lot of money. And it's based on a tissue of lies. Or his own truth, shall we say. That has made a lot of money by being sensationalist. And it's annoying if you're trying to write serious books, which you're trying to tell the truth rather than just being sensationalist. And those books won't sell as well. But it's like taking a diet. If you have a diet saying, eat less, and a diet saying just eat tomatoes, which one will be the bestseller.
But Scobie's book didn't sell well, and it was sensationalist.
Well, this one hasn't sold well. The first book did.
Right. I read some reviews saying, the worst thing you can say about a book, which is that it was boring.
Well, I think there are a lot of people there who are interested in the Meghan Harry story and will buy anything. And a lot of people are very sympathetic and feel that they've been traduced by the royal family and the press. But, my own feeling is, the press responded to Meghan, and the royal family did too, with open arms. They tried to integrate her. And I don't buy the story that she was forced out. She wanted to have everything on her own terms. And, and the point is that when you join the royal family, there's certain rules you follow. You can't commercialize your activities. You have to behave with a certain amount of dignity. And I've heard, she's like Fergie. She hasn't done that.
Yeah. It's a weird one, isn't it? Because I guess growing up, when I was younger, I'd have felt a little bit more about individual liberty, and it's like you should be able to do what you want, go in there, and then you can be ambitious and do your thing. And I think as I've gotten a bit older, I'm now seeing it as like, well, I don't believe that this serendipitous falling in love with a prince happens just like, I think you go after Prince Harry because you want to be part of that family.
Well, there's quite a lot of evidence that, she claimed not to know anything about him, and yet she had sort of posters of him on the wall and talked about him. So, again, you can't believe that story. And the various intermediaries, how they met, as that story has changed. But it's not about liberty. If she wants to go off as a member of the public and do things, that's fine. But she's doing it as a member of the royal family. If they want a title for their children, they still, of course, have the title Duke and Duchess of Sussex. And you can't have it both ways. If you take the title, you have to do the job. Yeah. Otherwise, you can be plain Mrs. Mountbatten Windsor, but she's not going to get the endorsements and the attention if she has that.
Would it have been possible for her to go in, and maybe Diana did this, or to go in and maybe ruffle a few feathers, but still be beloved, still be perceived to have done the duty of a royal, but being able to achieve maybe her ambitions, which is to be a bit of a model and a book writer and these kinds of things?
Well, I think everything was possible when she went in. And the Queen, for example, gave her the job of dealing with the Commonwealth, which would have been good, which would have played to what she thinks, the issues she thinks are important. She goes on about racism. So I think people tried to create a package that would play to her strengths. But, she's not a team player. And she wants to make a lot of money, which you can't do clearly in the royal family. She wanted to be controversial, which you can't be. It really wasn't going to work. You can't be half in, half out, I think was the line from the Queen. And she's absolutely right.
Does history just repeat itself with Edward and Wallis Simpson, The Traitor King, which is another book you've written? Tell me a bit about some of the parallels.
Well, there are interesting parallels. This is another case, for those who don't know the story of Edward VIII. This is a man who gave up the throne to marry an American divorcee. And so, okay, it's someone who inherited as opposed to was the spare. But, the behavior afterwards is very similar. There's the same fight, for example, over status, over titles. There's the same falling out with the family and siblings. There's the same debates over money, security, the curation of the story, working with tame journalists and biographers, trying to sue the press, endorsing the most inappropriate things like cutlery and bed linen, mixing with sort of trash, basically, cafe society.
Yeah.
So there are lots and lots of parallels. And I think if they'd looked at those parallels, there might have been a lesson there for them.
There was a quote I've got. Lonnie, as in you, reveals a couple obsessed with their status, financially exploiting their position and manipulating the media. Filled with treachery and betrayal, this is a story of an exiled royal and why the royal family never forgave him for choosing love over duty. And I read that thinking that could be either that could be Harry and Meghan, or
I think that was deliberate. That was done that's the publisher's blurb on Amazon. But exactly, and and a lot of people, I think have bought the book because they're interested in the parallels. There are also certain parallels, for example, with Andrew, who is the spare, and it's the same problem there of as with Harry, of trying to find a role for them when their characters aren't perhaps very suitable. Because clearly Edward and Anne have found roles, but Andrew, for example, likes money and golf, which is exactly what Duke of Windsor liked. So you do see patterns of behaviour, the same sort of standing on ceremony that the Duke of Windsor had, the pomposity and the arrogance you see again in Andrew. So there are, the trope of the Crown, I think, is very good. It's the debate between public duty and private pleasure. And the rogue royals that I write about want private pleasure, the Fergies, the Andrews, the Duke of Windsors. And then you have the dignified public servants who personify the monarchy. So the George V, George VI, the Queen, even Prince Philip, Princess Anne, Prince Charles, and Kate and William, exactly. So, and those are the two strands, and the problems arise when the ones who want to have a good time and use their position just for their own pleasure cause problems for all the others who are, putting their heads down and getting on with the job.
It is a difficult one because, as I was alluding to before, that I do like the idea of the rascal, the rebel, the heretic. That's what this show is about. And I like the idea that people are going, I'm not going to, because Kate and William they're fine and nice, and I have a lot of respect for them, but they're a little bit dull, I think.
Well, they have to be, I'm sure, it's a bit like the Queen. I feel very sorry because clearly here was a woman who was highly intelligent, great mimic, great sense of humour, and could never really show that in public. People talk about it, in private and with their family, and could be pretty acerbic and pretty ruthless. But we have this, image of her as this rather saintly figure. And that's the problem. We don't. Bagehot, who's the great sort of writer about the monarchy, said we don't want to let light in, and the problem is they have to let light in. They need the media to promote what they're doing, and when everyone has a smartphone and people are less deferential, their behaviour will be recorded. If you remember when Harry was on holiday with friends in Las Vegas and got into a stripping game at the pool table. Someone just pulled out a mobile phone and snapped him, and it was front page of the tabloids the next day. So it's very difficult to have a private life. And this, of course, is the great debate for people writing about them. Where does the private life stop and the public life begin? Is it legitimate to talk about, for example, marital problems? But, marital problems, for example, with Prince Charles and Diana had a huge, was very important in terms of the Constitution and what would happen. Would she be queen if they were divorced? Could Camilla be queen as a divorcee? All the questions that bedeviled Edward VIII was sort of coming back into play with Charles.
It's fascinating. There's also as we've alluded to as well, the sort of Hamlet Shakespeare problem of despair. Obviously, a lot of people don't have all that much sympathy for Harry because of the way he's gone about things. But you've seen it with Andrew, you've seen it with Harry. Edward's different, but maybe didn't feel like he was right, for the role or whatever, felt a bit of an outsider. That's quite a psychologically dangerous place to be in, I suppose.
Well, I mean, they've managed it in the past. So if you think going back, George VI was the spare, and he did inherit, but he had several brothers. So the Duke of Kent, for example, had a job in the civil service at one point. And, who knows what would have happened. He died during the Second World War in a plane crash. But the Duke of Gloucester, for example, had an army career. You think of Prince Michael of Kent, the Duke of Kent had army careers. Andrew had a career for 20 years in the Navy. I mean, the best thing would have been if he could have stayed. The problem was it's an up and out system in the Navy, and he'd reached basically the level of his talents. He wasn't going to be promoted. And that was the problem also with Harry, that Harry really wasn't going to go much further. But, the services are a good environment. They're protected. They can't go out in the town. They're probably stuck on a base or a ship or something. They have a discipline there, and they have a camaraderie, and they're treated as equals. Andrew found it very difficult when he said, I don't quite know when I wear my prince's hat. When am I a naval officer and when am I a royal? You'd have this bizarre thing where the ship would dock at a port, and he'd been reporting to the captain of the ship, and then he'd go and inspect some troops, and the captain would be walking 3 steps behind him. So it's a very difficult balance, but plenty of them have managed it. Edward, for a while, had a career with a theatre company, and that only collapsed because there was a sort of leak. I mean, he was stitched up because he was filming William at St Andrews. But I mean, I think he could have continued to work in the theatre if he'd wanted to. Others like Angus Ogilvy, who's married to Princess Alexandra, had a career in the city. So, there are opportunities for them.
Yeah.
I mean, both the Duke of York's children have jobs. I wouldn't say they have careers, but one works, I think, in the art world and one works in finance. So it's perfectly possible for Harry to have found a role if he had chosen to do so. Yeah. And there's a full-time role as a royal and doing the charity work. You don't have to go off and become a painter and decorator.
It's interesting what you say, though, about Harry and Andrew reaching their ceiling, because there's this great book, The Status Game by Will Storr, which I loved, and he views everything in life through the prism of status, and everybody's playing a slightly different game, which is why we're very snooty about games we don't enjoy. Say fashion, I'm not into fashion, so I sort of am very like, oh, what a load of rubbish that is, because I don't know how I'd be it's not my game. But whatever my game is, maybe podcasting, that is, I am quite competitive and status hungry, and you've got to always be having some sort of upward trajectory. And I think when you are a spare, you're born at near the top already, and you can't go any higher. I think that. Well,
I think it's. I mean, Charles was very jealous of Andrew because Charles's life was prescribed. He really couldn't, for example, go and serve in a war zone, which Andrew was allowed to do. His career in the Navy was very short. Andrew's had a 20-year career, which he'd signed up for. Andrew could get away with sleeping with inappropriate women. Charles more difficult because and marrying, frankly, a woman who was not a suitable member of the royal family. Charles couldn't do that. So there's quite a lot of jealousy between them. And I mean, Andrew had a pretty easy go of it. The tension was on Charles, and he was able to do a lot of things under the radar. So I don't buy the spare argument. I mean, I think it's much better to be the spare than to be the heir.
Interesting. Scar from The Lion King would disagree with you, but that's the sort of Macbeth. Oh, sorry, the Hamlet Lion King, isn't it? That's based on that. But one of the key differences between Harry and Edward, say, is this sort of stakes, because Edward, do we say allegedly or definitely worked with the Nazis?
Well, Edward Edward VIII was a supporter of the Nazis. He was certainly approached during the war to come back as a puppet king if the Germans invaded Britain, and he was certainly open to that. He was communicating with the enemy in code during the war, which was a capital offence. Wow. He tried to prevent America coming into the war, which of course made all the difference to us beating the Nazis. He was anti-Semitic. He believed in the Führerprinzip. Wow. He made a tour of Germany in 1937 where he inspected SS troops and saw all the Nazi leaders, including Hitler. So I think you can hardly call him anything except a Nazi sympathizer.
Wow. Why was it that he didn't want to take the throne just in England, but if it was as a puppet king, he'd have done it for the Nazis?
Well, I think partly he was maneuvered off the throne. I think no one thought he would be a suitable king here, and so they used the excuse of Wallace to get him off, and the excuse of the fact she was divorcee and problems. And he was adamant that he wanted to marry her. She actually didn't want to marry him, but he threatened to kill himself if she didn't. Ugh. So she was sort of emotionally blackmailed into it. But I think also once he realized what he'd given up, it's a bit like, you break up with your wife and then they remarry. You realize what you've given up. I think he wanted to big himself up in her eyes. He felt he made a mistake, and this was an opportunity to get back there. There was also, he was sympathetic to the Nazi aims. He felt the real enemy was Russia. But I think also there was a little bit about getting back at the family. And you've got to constantly remember that there are elements here of just personal animosity to the members of the family, but in that generation, and indeed now more recently, what's clearly Meghan's view of Kate is some form of jealousy, and she sees her as a vulnerable way of looking at damaging the monarchy. So there are all these other elements. I think sometimes people don't even know what motivates them; they just do it and don't think.
Yeah. Going cyclical, back to the beginning of the episode, we're talking about things being censored, not being able to get out. Churchill was among many who knew and didn't want this to get out, I believe.
Yes, I think the extraordinary thing is that Churchill, who'd been a great supporter of Edward VIII during the abdication, changed his views after he realised what an awful person he was. I mean, he was involved in negotiations for him to get money from the civil list. He was offered £25,000, and it was realised that actually he'd been taking a lot of money out of the duchy accounts, giving huge, expensive jewels and presents to Wallace, and he didn't need this money. And so Churchill really went against him, and then Churchill threatened him with a court-martial during the war. He was given the choice of going as governor of the Bahamas or being court-martialed, which is an extraordinary story.
Wow.
Never really been told before. And then after the war, when, if you've watched The Crown, you'll know something about this, there were German documents captured at the end of the war, which had been buried in the forest, and they were captured by the Americans. And these were the diplomatic traffic between Berlin and the various embassies. And it has the whole story of the plot, which was called Operation Willie, to entice Edward to work for the Germans when he was in Spain and Portugal in the summer of 1940, and other things as well. For example, discussions he had with a German cousin who was a Nazi. And before the war. And so this stuff they tried to suppress, and Churchill was involved in that. Some of the documents were destroyed, but because the American historians said, look, this is important historical material, it should be used, for example, at the Nuremberg trials, and this stuff must come out. But Churchill and Eisenhower managed to delay publication of this material until 1957. And it was then spun as basically the wild imaginings of these German diplomats, very consistent imaginings, and there was no truth in it whatsoever.
What about Dickie Mountbatten? Because again, you allege, or are we beyond the word allege, I think, because you found this in an FBI file, that he was a rampant offender and that his victims included children.
Yes, there's quite a lot of evidence that Mountbatten was a paedophile, not just the material in the FBI files, which went back to 1943, but testimony from a whole series of people, including his chauffeur during the Second World War, who claims to have taken young children to him or from him. There is evidence from the two boys I interviewed who were abused at Classieborne in August 1977. A third victim has come forward called Arthur Smith, who lives in Australia, and he's got a case going through the High Court in Belfast at the moment for some sort of compensation. Not against the Mountbatten family, but against Kincora, the boys' home in which he was kept, where a lot of these boys were trafficked. And there's quite a lot of other people have come forward with stories about Mountbatten's either bisexuality or his paedophilia. We have to stress that there is separate things. Yeah. So I think there's plenty of evidence there. And the fact that, Mountbatten is a subject where records are destroyed, people won't talk, I think is quite revealing. I've got a documentary which should be out soon where we have testimony from all sorts of people. For example, a man who was very close to a woman who ran a brothel in Pimlico, and Mountbatten would come there, and his big thing was getting dressed up in baby clothes. There's stories from journalists of a prostitute in Soho who used to beat him. So there are lots of different stories from, I think, pretty reputable sources. Often they've come to me by chance. So, for example, the brothel in Pimlico, someone wanted to offer me a biography of this woman, not knowing about my Mountbatten interest, but we wearing my agent's hat. And this was just literally a throwaway remark on one page. So there's a lot of evidence that's beginning to come to light on him. I mean, clearly most of the people who would know anything are dead now. But, diaries were kept, letters were sometimes written. There are documents around. And so I think there will be more and more of this emerging. And I think Arthur Smith is a very crucial witness because he's prepared to go on camera. He's given interviews. He's pursuing a court case. Other victims have tried court cases, but they've basically been run out of money to conduct them, or the tribunals have said it's out of time. So people have tried to shut down the case, and Arthur Smith seems to be going through. So I think Mountbatten's reputation will be reassessed in the next few years.
Wow, that's really interesting to see, to sort of be there for history being changed in that sense.
Well, here was a man who was the great hero of our time. I think it was one of the books. He did a 12-part series on the BBC, mentor to Charles.
What was his relation to Charles? Was familial?
Well, Philip, Prince Philip was Dickie's nephew. And he helped bring him up. Philip took his name, Mountbatten, when he was naturalised. It was Mountbatten who encouraged the romance with the Queen. It was Mountbatten who got him into the Navy. Philip might well have joined the Air Force and would probably have been killed in the Second World War. So the history would be very, very different. The Queen would have married someone else. So very, very close. He was the best man to Edward VIII, very close to George VI, early mentor to the Queen when she came to power. And so his influence has gone down through 4 generations, last great-grandchild of Queen Victoria. So he's very much part of the insider royal family.
Do you think it's possible he might have abused any of the young royals?
Well, I mean, people have suggested that. I found no evidence to support that, and I think it's very unlikely.
I'm only thinking because, again, that's secular. When offender, perpetrator, then victim, and that line.
Well, I think we certainly found, one of the things I did find was a man called Frederick Long who had married Mountbatten and had been his tutor when he was a teenager. When he was at Dartmouth, he had to go off and be personally tutored because he'd been ill. And what was fascinating is that in the miscellaneous correspondence for, I think, 1916, there are love letters from Frederick Lawrence Long to Dickie. And Long never married. He became a Church of England vicar. And this is the only correspondence in 54,000 files at Southampton which relate to Long. And yet Long must have remained in touch with Long because he was the minister who married him. So they must have been close. So I think there is some evidence that Long abused Mountbatten, and this is where it all began.
Wow. Yeah, that often it seems to be that way.
It's a pattern of behaviour.
Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. And then Mountbatten would use brandy and lemonade apparently to seduce, to bring out children in Kincora.
Well, that was what was interesting. That was the story that Norman Neild, the Second World War chauffeur, told, and that was only appeared in a paper in New Zealand. And that came out only because Norman Neild said, I've just read Spycatcher, it's got lots of attention, I've got an even bigger story. But the Norman Neild story was suppressed here. Robert Maxwell was sent it, one of the journalists, and the journalist who wrote the piece is still alive in Australia. And I hope will appear in this program.
Wow.
But the whole story was suppressed here. And that's the problem. So many of these stories just still don't get seen here. And, it's easier now with social media, and we have a much more pluralistic press, so it's more likely. But brandy and lemonade was actually one of his favorite drinks. It comes out in some research, and it's come out in other episodes. And I think people have come to that separately. It's not something that they would read up easily.
What is an MI5 blackmail honey trap?
Well, this is the reference to Kincora. A honey trap is basically when generally an intelligence service runs, for example, a brothel like Salon Kitty in by the Germans, the Nazis, and they use basically the pillow talk from the people there to get secrets. So the idea was that certainly in Salon Kitty, that people would say revealing things, and that would be passed back by the prostitutes. Kincora was a boys' home, and it was the boys clearly had no family. There was no one really keeping an eye on them. The man who ran Kincora, William McGrath, was involved with one of the loyalist organisations, and also a pedophile himself. And there's some evidence that he was trafficking boys from Kincora, because of course no one knew what was going on with them, to both rich Anglo-Irish, it was called the Anglo-Irish Vice Ring, a group of people centred on country houses across Ireland. But also, and the authorities, so MI5, who were the intelligence organisation in Northern Ireland, knew this, and they allowed this to happen because, of course, this gave them a chance to blackmail people to work for them. So there were quite a lot of loyalist terrorists, for example, who were involved in this, who were paedophiles. I mean, even suggestion that Jerry Adams, I think's brother, was convicted as a paedophile. So it was on both sides, and so they used these poor boys as pawns, really, to get these people by the short and curlies, and then get them to cooperate.
Why is it that the Irish government is holding stuff back and not letting you get the full information? Because wouldn't they want this to get to light?
No, they don't. They don't want. I mean, there was probably quite a lot of. A lot of this stuff is illegal. People turning a blind eye to it. In Northern Ireland, memories are long. There might well be repercussions to people as stuff came out. We always keep quiet about the informants, for example. So, no, I think it's a very sensitive subject, so I can understand why they want to shut it down. But, we have to think that also there are victims here. And these were young boys who really had no one to look out for them. And they were just pawns in a bigger game.
What does it mean to you as a writer to get this story validated and more for consensus and more known?
Well, I think these boys deserve justice. I think the truth needs to come out. I'm always pleased when other historians find information that I haven't got. So it's not just me banging this drum. The television programs, now have the courage to do it. I've been talking to the broadcaster for at least 5 years about this program, and they've been very nervous about doing it. So, I feel that there's been a recalibration, and people are more prepared to accept these things and to broadcast them. To suggest that the Prince Philip's uncle was a pedophile, I think would have been a difficult program even a few years ago. But now they're both dead, I think it's probably a bit easier. But yeah, I mean, I do the best I can with the books, research them heavily, and to find that they're validated by other people's research is always very encouraging. It means I'm not out on a limb, because it can be quite lonely sometimes saying some of the things I'm saying.
Yeah, there's another question I want to ask you, but first, just tell people where they can get. Where do you want to send them to?
Well, I mean, I'd love them. I mean, to see the sort of stuff I write. The most recent book is called Traitor King: The Scandalous Exile of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. It's on Amazon. The previous book, The Mountbattens: Their Lives and Loves. And then before that, I did intelligence history. I did a book called Stalin's Englishmen: The Lives of Guy Burgess. And the Prince Andrew book, I'm afraid, isn't sold yet, so it's not on Amazon. But I hope that will be out in 2025. If you Google my name, you will find my website. You can contact me there. You can record interest. You can pass me stories. And I too do a podcast called The Scandalmongers, which, again, if you just Google, will come up.
Who is a heretic that you admire?
That's a good question. I have a sort of admiration for Guy Burgess, because though he was a spy and he betrayed his country, he gave up a lot. He was, I think, he went against the grain. I mean, he picked his football team when he was in effect a teenager, and he stuck with them all the way through thick and thin. Lots of people were communist supporters as young men, and then either during the Nazi-Soviet Pact or during the Second World War or Czechoslovakia or other times, left the Communist Party. They certainly didn't work for the KGB, which was a brutal organization. So, I mean, in some ways, it's a grudging sympathy. But he did stick with them. He never recanted. He fled to Russia, which is a pretty awful place when he went there in 1951. He stood by what he believed was right. He believed there were two big power blocks, America and Russia. And in order to avoid a world war, he had to help Russia, because he'd seen some of the secrets as a Foreign Office official, and some of the things that were going on which he didn't agree with. So I think he was a true heretic, really, because his life really suffered as a result of sticking with this decision he made, as I say, as a teenager.
I think you're a true heretic, and I think people should go and get Andrew's books. The links are below. You've got a few to choose from, and his podcast, of course. Links are there. Do go and check them out. And please keep watching this channel. There's going to be a very similar topic right here for you to watch. Just click it and keep watching.